After studying this module, you shall be able to know about how the 12th plan would be financed, understand the need for financing private investment, assess the significant measures to be adopted in plan financing, understand the resource availability of center and states in the 12th plan, analyze the effect of service tax and GST on tax revenues, understand how effective allocation of public sector resources is to be undertaken in the 12th plan.
The objective of the 11th five-year plan was faster and inclusive growth, and the initiatives taken in this period have resulted in substantial progress towards both the objectives. Inevitably, there are some weaknesses that need to be addressed and new challenges that need to be faced. Some of the challenges themselves originate from the economy's transition to a higher and more inclusive growth path, the structural changes that come with it, and the expectations it generates. There are external challenges arising from the fact that the global economic development is much less favorable than it was at the start of the 11th plan. These challenges call for renewed efforts on multiple fronts, learning from the past experience and keeping in mind global developments. To make projections of the public sector resources for the 12th plan period, it was assumed that the target gross domestic product growth rate of 8.2% could be achieved. The projections implied that public sector resources for the plan will need to be at 11.8% of the GDP in the 12th plan as against 10.96% realized in the 11th plan. However, the outcome will depend critically on achievements of buoyancy in tax revenue, effective control over subsidies, and an improvement in the resource mobilizing capacity of the public sector enterprises, both at the center and at the state levels.
In the 12th plan, main emphasis would be on enhancing the capacity for growth, enhancing skills and faster generation of employment, managing the environment, markets for efficiency and inclusion, decentralization, empowerment and information, technology and innovation, securing the energy future for India, accelerated development of transport infrastructure, rural transformation and sustained growth of agriculture, managing urbanization, improved access to quality education, better preventive and curative health care. Let us discuss the size of 12th Public Sector Plan. To achieve the target gross domestic product growth rate of 8.2% for the 12th plan period, the projections envisage gross budgetary support for the plan increasing from 4.92% of GDP in 2011-12 to 5.75% of GDP by its end. The increase in the GBS as a percentage of GDP over a 5-year period is only 0.83% of GDP. The plan allocations must increase by around 1.5 percentage points as a percentage of GDP for sectors such as health, education, and infrastructure. However, given the limited increase projected in the central GBS, strict prioritization will be needed as resources for other sectors will expand more slowly than GDP. The non-plan expenditure in the projections is expected to decline from 9.09% of GDP in 2011-12 to 7.36% of GDP in 2016-17. This implies an average annual growth of around 10% in nominal terms or about 5% in real terms. Non-plan expenditure includes interest payments, defense expenditure, pay and allowances, pensions, subsidies, and others. Interest payment is forecast on the basis of projected growth of debt with interest rate 8.7% on annual incremental borrowings, keeping in mind the target for the reduction of fiscal deficit. Defense expenditure is projected to fall from 1.83% of GDP in the base year to 1.56% of GDP in the final year. This is based on defense revenue and defense capital expenditure increasing annually in nominal terms by about 7.5% and 15% respectively. Since defense expenditure is already very low as a percentage of GDP, this projection may be conservative. Pay and allowances are projected to grow at an annual rate of 7% in nominal terms, as there will be little expansion in government employment and there may not be any impact of the new pay commission over this period. Pension expenditure is projected to grow at an annual rate of 9%, which is the level assumed by the 13th Finance Commission. Subsidies account for 18.8% of the total projected non-plan expenditure during the 12th plan and are projected to decline from an estimated 1.6% of GDP in 2011-12 to 1.24% of GDP in the final year. Financing private investment. As the private sector is involved in making two-thirds of the investment in the economy, there is a need for strengthening the financial system to make it capable of mobilizing household savings. Effective allocation of savings would ensure that the equity and debt needs of the fast expanding private corporate sector are met.
Special attention must be paid to the financing needs of private sector investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure investment in sectors such as electricity, roads, bridges, telecommunications, railways, irrigation, water supply and sanitation, ports, airports, storage and oil gas pipelines will need to increase from about 8% of the GDP in 2011-12 of the plan to about 10% of the GDP in 2016-17. The total investment in infrastructure would have to be over rupees 45 lakh crores during the 12th plan period. The Finance Ministry has announced guidelines for establishing infrastructure debt funds, which will help infrastructure companies to refinance short-term bank debt with long-term debt, thereby freeing banks to finance new corporate investment. This will not only help leverage private investment in infrastructure through faster financial closure of public-private partnership, but also crowd private investment to propel Indian economy to a higher growth path. Along with larger outlays from the public sector, a more than proportional rise in private investment would be required. Private and PPP investments are estimated to have accounted for a little over 30% of the total investment in infrastructure in the 11th plan. Their share may have to rise to 50% in the 12th plan.
Let us now look at some significant measures in plan financing. While equity markets are now well regulated, pension and insurance reforms that have been pending need to be undertaken on a fast track basis to act as efficient routes through which household savings can be mobilized for corporate investment. They can also provide financial security to a large section of population that has been excluded from the benefits of modern financial services. A large part of household savings are currently absorbed by the government to finance the fiscal deficit. As fiscal consolidation is undertaken and household savings remain high, more funds are likely to be available for corporate debt investment. The creation of a vibrant and liquid corporate bond market should be taken up on priority basis. Reform of the government securities market is also essential for the establishment of a government securities yield curve for all maturities against which corporate bonds can be priced. The public sector banking system needs to achieve economies of scale through both capital infusion and consolidation. If government ownership of equity in public sector banks cannot be diluted below 51%, there is no alternative to providing budgetary resources to build up the capital of public sector banks. For financial inclusion, the approach has been to open more and more rural branches, which involves very high costs. However, with advancements in mobile and information technology, the banking correspondence model can be used to improve financial access for ordinary households in underserved areas. This must be expedited in the 12th plan. The introduction of goods and services tax could also make the economy more competitive and help accelerate growth to the levels being targeted in the 12th plan. Let us now discuss the resource availability in the 12th plan. Center's resource fiscal deficit is estimated to decline during the 12th plan. The gradual scaling down of the fiscal deficit will inevitably restrict the government from making larger public investments through borrowing, but is expected to bring returns in the long run. Dependence on borrowings, which increase resource availability but also increase the outstanding debt and interest burden, needs to be limited. The center's net borrowing, which was 5.9% of GDP in 2011-12, is estimated to decline to 5.1% of GDP in 2012-13. The projection of fiscal deficits based on medium-term fiscal policy statement 2012-13 as per FRBM indicates that debt resources for funding of GBS for the 12th plan will be higher initially but is projected to decline gradually. The fiscal deficit as percent of GDP is further projected to decline to 4.5% in 2013-14, 3.9% in 2014-15, 3.2% in 2015-16, and 3% of GDP in 2016-17. The 13th Finance Commission Award increased the devolution to the states from 30.5% to 32% of divisible pool. This has increased the state's share to gross tax revenue of the center, exclusive of cesses, surcharge, and cost of collection, which does not constitute shareable pool, from about 26% to more than 28%, thereby increasing their capacity to finance the plan. Inability to pass on increases in global oil prices to the consumers would have a substantial impact on resources for the plan if this situation is not rectified urgently. The balance from current revenue as percentage of GDP was projected at 2.31% for the 11th plan, which turned negative by minus 0.61%. However, with buoyancy in tax revenue and a decline in non-plan expenditure, BCR is estimated to be 1.88% of the GDP for the 12th plan. The imposition of the fiscal deficit ceiling ensures that borrowings, including net miscellaneous capital receipts, decline from 5.06% of GDP in the 11th plan to 3.35% in the 12th plan. Let us now discuss the state resources. The fiscal deficit of the states as a whole remained below 3% of GDP during the 11th plan period, while prescribing different fiscal paths for individual states. The 13th Finance Commission has also set the fiscal deficit's target of 3% of GDP to be achieved by 2014-15 by all states. Accordingly, the fiscal deficit limit of all states, which has been a little over 3% of the GDP in 2012-13, is projected to remain around 2.22% during the 12th plan period. This inevitably limits the scope for mobilizing debt resources of the states. Therefore, they have to look at improving revenue realization and controlling non-plan expenditure.
Mobilization of resources of such a magnitude for the 12th plan is contingent upon significant improvement in the state's own resources, mainly through improved BCR. The states will have to step up efforts to increase their own tax and non-tax revenue collections through better tax administration, plugging the scope for leakages and recovery of cost-based user charges. It is assumed that there would not be any additional burden on account of pay commission related salary increase for majority of the states during the plan period. Further, the devolution of taxes have been assumed at the 13th Finance Commission level for the last 2 years of the plan. The central assistance being transferred to the states in the 12th plan amounts to 1.26% of the GDP, which is the same as the 11th plan. However, the central assistance is not the only means of plan transfer. Substantial plan transfers take place through the centrally sponsored schemes, which have been greatly expanded in the 12th plan. Accordingly, the states will receive larger transfers of total plan resources from the center. Regarding the structure of financing projected in the 12th plan for the center and the states, the 12th plan projections show relatively modest dependence on borrowings amounting to nearly 46% of the total plan resources compared with nearly 67% in the 11th plan realization. The high dependence on borrowings during the 11th plan was the outcome of expansionary fiscal measures of the center to counter economic slowdown affected by global financial crisis and inevitable increase in expenditure. With sharp fall in revenue collection, the center had to mobilize more resources through borrowings. As against this, tighter fiscal discipline is envisaged both for the center and the states during the 12th plan period.
Assuming that the economy will return to a higher growth trajectory and with good revenue buoyancies, the revenue collection is projected to grow annually by about 17% on average. This is reflected in the large improvement in balance from current revenue, which is projected to increase from 3.7% of the total public sector planned resources in the 11th plan to 29.16% of the total public sector planned resources for center and states taken together in the 12th plan. To meet the required plan finances, the total resources for the central and state plans taken together have to increase from an average of 10.96% of GDP in the 11th plan to an average of 11.8% of GDP in the 12th plan. The increase of 0.84% of GDP in total resources for the plan has to be achieved keeping borrowing within the stipulated limit and reducing the fiscal deficit of the center and states to 3% on each account in the last year of the 12th plan. Tax revenues recorded in the recent past have shown a lot of swings due to economic slowdown affected by global financial crisis. The annual growth of gross tax revenue collection, which dipped to 2 to 3% in 2008-9 and 2009-10, returned to a healthy growth of 27% in 2010-11, followed by 13.69% in 2011-12. With the recovery of the economy and proposal to mobilize additional tax revenues, gross tax revenue is estimated to grow by about 19.5% in 2012-13 over the previous year. From 2011-12 onwards, minimum alternative tax will be calculated on the basis of gross assets as opposed to book profits. The new rate has been decided at 2%, which will be reduced to 0.25% in case of banking organizations. This shift signifies that now even loss-making organizations will be subjected to taxes. Business organizations will no longer need to pay wealth taxes. With regards to capital gains taxes, there will be no differentiation between short and long-term gains. This implies greater tax expenditure for investment related transactions. Securities and transaction tax will be done away with. Tax exemptions will not be provided for reverse mortgages, so selling a capital asset under a reverse mortgage program will be regarded as taxable transfer and will be subjected to capital gains taxes. The Union Finance Ministry has opted to do away with the allowance granted for interest paid on housing loan that has been taken against a self-occupied property, keeping with the government's intentions to provide the least possible tax exemptions. International companies will be regarded as resident even if some part of their management is functioning in India and subjected to taxes on their global income as well. As royalty is included in the newly proposed code, subscription revenue earned by the international organizations will be subjected to taxes if any part of their management is located in the country.
Efforts are being made to introduce unified goods and services tax in consultation with states, bringing a major reform of the indirect tax system and a very promising source of revenue. However, the scope for expanding the service tax net to more and more services gets narrower as the net is widened. The contribution of expanding tax net will therefore reduce over time. The preponderance of small service providers below the taxable limit of turnover constrains the scope of revenue mobilization beyond a certain level.
The introduction of GST will usher in major reforms of indirect taxes in the center and states. The 12th plan assumptions on tax resources of the center and states envisage revenue neutrality of GST, although there might be positive spin-off effects of GST, mainly through better tax compliance. The resource projection, based on the estimates made by the working group on the center's resources, with some changes given the changed economic scenario, yields a projection of GBS of the center, which indicates that it will grow from 5.3% of GDP in 2012-13 to 5.22% of GDP in 2016-17. The tax revenue, net of states' share, increases from 7.6% of GDP in 2012-13 to 8.79% of GDP in 2016-17, averaging 8.27% during the 12th plan. Collection of direct tax has remained higher than the indirect tax collection since 2008-9 and projected to have similar trend during 12th plan. With the reforms being undertaken, the total subsidies as a proportion of GDP are projected to decline to 1.5% by 2016-17. Now let us discuss the allocation of public sector resources. The allocation of public sector resources for the 12th plan between the center and the states, union territories, and the proposed sectoral distribution of the resources aims at achieving faster and more inclusive growth. The projected assessment of resources of the public sector for the 12th plan of 80 lakh 50,123 crore at current prices comprises of the center's share at 43 lakh 33,739 crore and the state's union territories share at 37 lakh 16,385 crore. The resources for the central plan include the gross budgetary support component of 27 lakh 10,840 crore and the internal and extra budgetary resources component of 16 lakh 22,899 crore at current prices. The biggest increase in allocation of centers gross budgetary support is for health and child development, urban development, and education. The share of health and child development in centers GBS goes up to 11.45% as compared to 7.09% in the 11th plan. The share of urban development increases from 3.99% in the 11th plan to 4.6% in the 12th plan. The share of education goes up to 12.71% in 12th plan. The percentage increase in GBS for scientific departments, agriculture, and water resources is also substantial. The increase in budgetary support for infrastructure in transport and energy sectors is impressive, considering that a large portion of investments in these sectors would be made from the resources of CPSEs and through public-private partnerships. The resources for rural development programs in the areas of housing, employment, and livelihood had been substantially increased during the 11th plan as compared to the initial allocations. Even a moderate increase in resources for these programs proposed in the 12th plan over this high base means a substantial budgetary support for these programs.
Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Keeping in mind the approach adopted for the 12th plan, that is faster, sustainable and inclusive growth, the projection of the GBS allocation to different sectors, the ministries, departments and the support to the state UT plan has been made. The 12th plan aims at putting the economy on a sustainable growth trajectory with a growth rate of 9.1% by the end of the plan period by targeting robust growth in agriculture at 4% per year and by creating productive employment at the faster pace than before. The 12th plan focuses on poverty reduction, ensuring access to basic physical infrastructure, health and education facilities to all, while giving importance to bridging the regional, social, gender disparities and attending to the marginalized and weaker social groups. A major structural shift across sectors has been proposed by allocating more resources to the priority areas identified for ensuring inclusiveness.